revolution went out the window.
In 1801, David produced this heroic image of Napoleon crossing the Alps at the head of his army. On the rocks below, David inscribed Napoleon's name, along with those of the great conquerors of the Alps, Hannibal and Charlemagne. And so in many ways, the image is an exercise in political propaganda, with Napoleon cast as an idealised hero, master of not only his army, but of nature itself. Napoleon refused to sit for David, which is perhaps why the portrait looks unlike any other of him. Subsequently, though, the painting was extremely well received, and Napoleon ordered several copies. David quickly establishes himself as the chronicler of Napoleon and Napoleon's reign. But his greatest work, or at least his biggest, coincides with Napoleon's greatest personal triumph, his crowning as emperor in December 1804. And it's that image, when Napoleon is actually crowning his empress, Josephine, that forms the basis of this work that David wanted to be almost the biggest painting that existed in France. So it's a painting that proclaims the monstrous ego of David and the even more monstrous ego of Napoleon. Not surprisingly, this vast undertaking took David the best part of 2 years, bolstered by the fact that Napoleon had made him first painter to the emperor. And he sets himself up in a deconsecrated church as his studio and gets set builders from the Paris Opera to reconstruct parts of Notre Dame Cathedral in which the ceremony itself had taken place. And there's over 70 recognisable portraits, from Napoleon's brothers, here on the left of the picture, through to the Empress, who incidentally was 41 years old when this was painted. So David's done a very good rejuvenation job on her. To Napoleon's stepson, who here holds a sword, rather lightheartedly, that the two choir boys can have a look at. But in the end, the whole painting is staged and lit so that there is no doubt that Napoleon is here at the heart. And when you look at the work, there's something sumptuous about the colours and about the way that David's applied paint. And in a way, we can see here that he's moving away from neoclassicism, from that manifesto proclaimed style with the Oath of the Horatii, to a style that you might call Napoleonic or Empire, where things become looser and more celebratory. And then, in the scale of the work, the viewer is invited almost to step into the picture and get privileged access to an event that only the great and the good in Paris, and by extension in France, would have had access to. But perhaps most crucially for David, what matters is what Napoleon thinks, and actually he's bowled over by the work. He says this is not a painting, you can actually walk around in the picture. And then he adds that life is everywhere. Soon after the completion of the coronation, commissions from Napoleon dried up, partly due to the massive fees that David requested. However, he did paint one last portrait. The commission came from a Scottish aristocrat who paid the enormous sum of 1,000 guineas to have this portrait of the French emperor. David depicts him in a very sympathetic light, emphasising his dedication and achievements, despite the fact that Napoleon was in effect a tyrant who plunged the whole of Europe into a prolonged series of brutal wars. As Napoleon's Grande Armée battled across Europe, David was working on this painting, Leonidas at Thermopylae, which he'd begun originally in 1798. The work shows the king of Sparta and his army as they face certain death at the hands of the Persians. Napoleon commented that David shouldn't waste his time painting the defeated, a remark that proved rather poignant in view of what was just about to happen. After the disastrous attempted invasion of Russia, the sun seemed to be setting for Napoleon's Grande Armée when it was defeated at the Battle of Leipzig. And by March 1814, the Allied armies were here in Paris, and Napoleon was forced to abdicate. And there were Russian soldiers camping along the Champs-Élysées, and two of them were even billeted under the same roof as David and proclaimed themselves to be delighted to be sharing the house of Europe's most famous painter. And the Allies re-established the Bourbon monarchy under Louis XVIII. And David, loyal as ever to Napoleon, withdrew from public life. Although Napoleon was exiled to the Mediterranean island of Elba, he returned to France at the beginning of 1815 for one final campaign, but was defeated at the Battle of Waterloo. Subsequently, all anti-monarchists, as well as Napoleon supporters, were forced into exile from France by King Louis XVIII. But David, because he was so immensely famous, was permitted to stay. However, such was his own distaste at the monarchy, he decided to come into exile and moved here to Brussels a year later, in 1816. And although he was getting on at the time, he was 67, he set up a rather profitable business, painting the portraits of French exiles as well as the Belgian aristocracy. While he was in Brussels, David also painted mythological scenes, notably this work, which is familiar in a way in its neoclassicism, but also slightly crackers. It shows the god of war, Mars, being seduced and disarmed by the goddess of love, Venus, with her handmaidens, the three graces in the background, frolicking about, not looking particularly graceful. And on one level, I think David, as an old man, is trying to experiment. He knows that the end is perhaps not too far away. He's suffering from chronic heart disease at the time. He's also knocked down by a horse and cart on his way back from the theatre whilst he's in the process of painting this work, but he still manages to finish it. And he describes this work as his adieu to painting.
In his last years, David was begged to return to France, but he never did, an opponent of the Bourbons till the end. In 1825, after 9 years of exile in Brussels, the 77-year-old David died in the arms of his son Eugène. Although refused burial in France, David received a lavish funeral in Brussels. At the post-mortem, the family were given his heart in a silver urn, and at the death of his mother in 1826, Eugène buried his father's heart alongside her in the cemetery of Père-Lachaise in Paris. David's influence on European painting was immense, although he was later blamed for the decline of French art into a form of sterile academic classicism. But he managed to produce work which struck a chord with the conservative Ancien Régime, with the zealots of the French Revolution, and with Napoleon. He gave contemporary life and its struggles something of the grandeur of ancient Rome or Greece, and produced painting which reads as a monument to the control, boldness, intellect, and ambitions of its creator.